Okay, that was the prosecution's opening statement in the Timothy Coggins case. We're talking about the trial of Frank Gebhardt, and I want to get some analysis right now. Joining us is criminal defense attorney Ross Kramer. Ross, good to see you, and welcome back to Law and Crime.
Thanks for having me.
Our theme today is brutal killings, and this is really horrific. You have a young boy, 30 stab wounds, stabbed multiple times, dragged through the clay. What the idea of how he was killed back in 1983, that level of just really, really horrific injuries, does that give you a clue as to who did this?
I think so. I mean, I think you're looking for someone who had a real motive, first of all, who had some real problems in themselves, and second, who had a real motive to act in this just over-the-top way. But watching that opening statement, that was a really effective opening statement, I thought. I thought that the prosecutor was able to focus the jury on what to look for here and to overcome all of the deficiencies in that case. I thought of all the cases that we've watched recently here, I thought that was a really effective opening statement.
Look, we're talking about Georgia back in 1983, and we're talking about 2018. A lot has changed in 35 years. The idea and what we heard her say, and we kind of going to hear this a little bit more with the defense, is jury, don't let your feelings dictate your decision. Let the evidence show one way or another. I'm curious how important that is, because you're thinking about this young man who was killed so many years ago, and if someone was brought on trial 35 years ago, would that have been the same concern as it is now?
I think that's always the concern with a jury, and I think we have to give juries a lot of credit because they are able, in most of these cases, to parse through the emotions swirling around these very difficult cases and get to the evidence. I think any lawyer or any judge or any defendant who underestimates how sharp a jury is in a case like this is setting themselves up for failure. Juries actually take these cases very seriously and are good at getting to the root of the case.
I mean, it's remarkable that we're talking about finding justice for him 35 years later. The idea is, and she said it very well, the first investigation was horrible. It was botched. I mean, how is that possible?
Well, the first investigation was terrible. They lost evidence over time.
How does that happen? How do you lose evidence?
Well, look, these are prosecutors' offices that just aren't run the way that we would hope they're run. This is not the FBI maintaining evidence in a vault somewhere. This is a local prosecutor's office. Number one, didn't take this case seriously in the first place. People change, at that office over time. People throw away things. It's just a terrible shame.
Was it something more nefarious, though? Was it they were deliberately hiding evidence? I mean, was there a level of racism? Was there something they didn't care about this case? Do you sense that?
Well, certainly in the fact that the investigation got short shrift in 1983, I think, and I think the prosecutor is owning that in the opening statement, that this was an embarrassing investigation. I think they closed it after something like 3 weeks with a horrific killing like this. You would think they would have been investigating this indefinitely, that this would never have been a closed case. In a small community like this with a set number of suspects, they would have really continued working this case. But they didn't. I don't know, and I don't think the prosecutor knows, I don't think the defense knows if there's something more nefarious towards about the evidence disappearing. But really, it's a terrible blow to the prosecutor. It's a gift to the defense attorney in a case like this. But she seems confident in this opening that she's going to be able to overcome it.
I'm glad you mentioned the defense, and because they're going to pick holes in this investigation. And when we come back, we're going to play you the defense's opening statement. And they're going to explain to you how the investigators, the state, they have the wrong man. We'll be right back. And welcome back, everybody. We're covering the Timothy Coggins brutal killing back in 1983. Frank Gebhardt is one man who was charged in connection with this horrific crime. And right now, we are recapping this case in its entirety. Where we just left off, we saw the prosecution's opening statement, so we're right at the beginning. And now we're going to move into the defense's opening statement. And as Ross Kramer and I were just talking about before our last break, you know the defense is going to really harp on the fact that the initial investigation into this murder was botched. Take a look.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Broder told you this is a cold case. It is. It's a really old case. But the state does not get a pass because the case is old. They have to prove to you this case just like they prove any other case. If this murder happened yesterday, the burden beyond a reasonable doubt, whether it happened yesterday or 30 years ago, you don't give the state a pass on their burden just because of how old the case is. Now, Ms. Broder told you a lot about what people are going to say that Mr. Gebhardt said over the years. But Ms. Broder didn't tell you yet about who it's coming from. And I want y'all, during the trial, to pay close attention to who is saying these things. One of their main witnesses is going to be Christopher Vaughn. Christopher Vaughn is going to say that back in the 80s, he heard Mr. Gebhardt say something about this murder. Wow. Well, then he must have run straight to the police and said something about it, right? No. You're going to hear that 22 or so years later, after Mr. Vaughn is in prison for child molestation, that he came forward and wanted to give information about his case. And you're going to hear from the officers themselves that took his statement. And probably from him too. That his hope was he'd get some kind of help out of this for his case. There's been some talk about how there are details in these statements that nobody could have known. Now, 3 of the people we expect that's going to take this stand and tell you that Mr. Gebhardt told them about this crime are people who found the body in 1983. Charles Carey Jr., Willard Sanders, and Christopher Vaughn. On October 9th, they're the ones that walked up on the body. They're the ones that found it. And 20 and 30 years later, they're the ones telling you Mr. Gebhardt said something about killing us. You're going to hear from some folks who are jailhouse informants, put it that way. You're going to hear from a couple of guys, I imagine, who are going to say while they were in jail with Frankie that he made statements about this case. Again, I just want you to remember and look at where is that information coming from? What is their motivation for telling this?
That was some of the defense's opening statement there. And you'll remember the prosecution really wants to tie Gebhardt to the Coggins murder based upon alleged statements he made throughout the years, bragging about what he did. Now, Ross, do you believe what the defense attorney said, that you can't believe these witnesses? You have to question what they said about what Frank Gebhardt said, because look at who they are. Look at where that's coming from. Is that a valid argument? Absolutely. I mean, you do have to scrutinize cooperator statements a lot more closely. That's an instruction that the jury will get actually from the judge on the law. And, you know, the prosecution embraced that. They said these stories differ over time. Some of these people, some of these witnesses may not be people that you would otherwise expect to come and testify and otherwise trust. But you know what? I would say the majority of prosecution's cases are made on cooperator testimony, on informant testimony, on the testimony of people that jurors might not otherwise trust or like. And prosecutors get convictions on that all the time. And a lot of times because that's the only evidence there is that they have to use, and that evidence is often corroborated by other facts that make that testimony trustworthy. Two things to note. We're going to get into that in a second. We're showing you some pictures of other individuals in this case. It should be noted, that other people, including one former corrections officer and a police officer, were actually charged with obstruction of justice. They've been alleged to have derailed the investigation into the Coggins murder once it reopened back in March of 2017. So there's a lot of people that have been implicated in what happened to Coggins. But just to get back to the defense, can you make a successful case here by the prosecution just based upon what other people have said that they heard Frank Gebhardt said? Because I know the physical evidence in this case may be lacking.
I think that's the hope, that they're going to make the case out of witness testimony, but I think they have to have other corroborating information, and the prosecutor promised that, and the defense lawyer even talked about it. You know, some witnesses are going to say that they have knowledge that is unique, that they shouldn't have had, that only the police kept under wraps. And it's going to be interesting to see how the witness testimony develops. It can't just be jailhouse snitches giving generic information. There's going to have to be specific details that made the prosecution trust them and put them up on the stand under their own name.
Well, talking of physical evidence, you and I had talked about, it was believed that Frank Gebhardt took the murder weapon, a knife, and threw it in his well. They dug up that well, and didn't they find pieces of a Japanese knife in there? What was your take on what they found?
Yeah, I think that was important because I think it corroborated one of the witness statements. I think there was a witness who's going to testify that the defendant told him that he threw the murder weapon down a well at some point. So I think after the evidentiary hearing in this case, they went back, they looked in that well, and they found what we were just talking about, corroborating evidence. Because the prosecution is going to have to tell the jury here they were skeptical about all of these witnesses until something changed their mind, whether it's a unique piece of evidence, whether it's corroborating their testimony through the finding of physical evidence. So I think that's going to play a big role here.
Should be noted, though, it's believed that he was filling that well with trash for the past 20 years. So is it so surprising that they found maybe a piece of a knife? It's one way to look at it. Listen, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to play you the testimony of people, the last people to see Timothy Coggins alive. We'll be right back.
A regular club.
Was it common for Caucasian people to go to this club?
No. No, it wasn't.
Do you recall what time you dropped Tim Coggins off at the club?
Now, it might have been right before 12. Because I can remember he asked me for some money. He said, I need some money. I said, oh, you must be broke. And he said, yes, sir. So I gave him $5. And I said, now, you get you something? Because he told me he was hungry. I said, well, you get you something to eat. Now, if I find out that you done spent this money on something else, you're going to have to suffer the consequences, and you know what that is. And as he exited the vehicle, there, when we got to the People's Choice, people everywhere. I mean, all over the place. And so I told him, I said, Tim, be careful. And then all of a sudden, I see 3 white guys standing in front of the club. And as a police officer, things like that seem strange to you. Because Caucasians did not visit that club.
Was that the last time that you saw Tim Coggins?
The last time I saw him, he was posted up in our squad room. That was the last time that I saw him.
I don't know, Ross, I think it's remarkable to hear somebody talking about something, the details, 35 years ago. I don't even remember what I ate for breakfast 20 minutes ago, so it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that it's very fortunate for the prosecution that they have a witness like this who can have this kind of recall. But you know what? This was such an important event in people's lives. How many days do you have a friend who ends up being murdered later that night? I mean, maybe these things just end up burned in your mind, but I'm sure the defense is going to make a lot of weight out of the fact that this guy supposedly has such a vivid memory.
Generally, does that happen a lot? You know, we talk about remarkable instances. Can somebody be living a normal life and then something happens and then they recount what happened earlier in the day? You know what I mean? Like a lot of these cases, the witnesses, they're living their lives and something incredible happens. And, you know, that's always, I find that interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the prosecution actually addressed it in their opening statement, saying, I can't remember what I had for breakfast 2 weeks ago, but I remember everything that happened on the day my kids were born. I remember what I was wearing, what I was feeling that day. That's what they're relying on here to make this a credible witness.
Let's move on, though, to the next person that's going to testify, and this is somebody very close to Timothy Coggins. This is Talisa Coggins, his sister, who remembered seeing him interact with some white people at the club. Very important fact. Let's see.
All right. Did you ever go to the People's Choice and see Tim there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Do you recall one occasion in particular where you saw Tim dancing with someone that struck you as unusual?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Tell the jury about that.
I remember him dancing with this white lady at the club, and well, to me, I felt like with him being such a great dancer, she would ask him to show her how to dance, and I do remember her being there.
Okay. Do you remember her being there more than one time?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Do you remember how many times?
I give or take maybe 4 or 5.
Okay. And was she with Tim often when she would come to the club?
Well, I can't say often because I wasn't there often myself, but the time I was there, I do recall seeing them dancing.
Did Tim ever tell you who she was?
I never asked, but I do recall the very first time I seen her sitting at the bar, and the very first time I seen her talking with Tim, I didn't like it. I didn't feel comfortable with it.
Tell the jury why you didn't feel comfortable.
Well, mainly because it was to me, this is just my opinion. When you see a white person come to an all-black club, and if they ain't like came with somebody and just pop up by themselves, to me it raises a red flag.
Did you remember anything about her hair or body or anything like that?
Yeah, I remember her being just about my height, and I can't tell you exactly about her face, but I know she had long brown hair.
Okay.
Okay, so that was Timothy Coggins' sister recalling the events the last time she ever saw her brother alive. Ross, let's go back and talk about a potential motive here. The idea here that he was dancing with a white woman as a cause for what ultimately happened to him. We can't forget that this woman testified that a decapitated black dog was left outside their door along with a note that read, "You're next." Can you imagine what Georgia was like back in 1983, that this might be a potential motive for what happened to him?
No, we keep saying back in 1983, but really, it was only 35 years ago. These are things you would expect to hear from America and the Southeast in the 1950s and the 1930s. The 1980s, it just blows your mind to think that this was still going on, that this kind of racial divide, that white people showing up at black clubs or black people talking to a white woman could be the root of what happened here in a case like this.
And it still goes on. You know, this still goes on throughout the country. I mean, this isn't, you know, something that's crazy. But what's interesting today, and we talked about it before, is the concern was that back in 1983, everybody was indifferent to a young African-American male being killed. That's not the case today. And that is why I think it's so important that these cold cases heat up.
I think it's important that these cold cases heat up, and I think it's important that the world is watching, that prosecutors are taking this seriously, are reopening these cases, that juries are taking these cases seriously, that witnesses are willing to come forward and testify in 2018.
And the idea that putting these witnesses on, if you're a defense attorney, do you try to hit on their credibility? Do you try to hit on their recall? I mean, we are talking something years ago.
Well, absolutely. I think you have to be very careful with the victim's sister. But with, you know, witnesses who are just eyewitnesses, you talk about how, you know, there could be failures in recollection over time. You talk about the differences and contradictions between their stories. And then once we get to look at the jailhouse informants, they have a tremendous bias and a reason and a motive to testify falsely, to give prosecutors any information they want, to get leniency for themselves.
What did you make of the fact that other people were charged with obstruction of justice in this investigation?
Well, that's a tough one. I don't think we've seen enough to really understand yet what that theory is. but people within the police department trying to hold back this investigation once it was reopened, that's a terrible commentary on 2017, 2018, and how things are still conducted in Georgia.
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, we're talking today about brutal killings. When we come back, we're going to play you the testimony of the medical examiner, and he will explain exactly what happened to Timothy Coggins. We'll be back. Okay, Ross, let's just really break it down here. Timothy Coggins was sliced, he stabbed more than 30 times. His lungs were punctured, his genitals were mutilated, and he was tied with a logging chain to the back of a truck and dragged up and down a field along a rural road. We're talking about brutal killings today. I don't know if it gets more brutal than that kind of killing. So the idea of someone doing this, and you're listening to the medical examiner, what does this tell you?
Well, it tells you that the motive has to be something extraordinary, and the prosecution has to convince the jury that there was something going on here beyond an everyday dispute between two people. And I think that's what the prosecution is setting up here. I think by showing the tattoos that the defendant has, by showing the relationship between the deceased and a white woman at the bar, I think they're showing the rage that was building up that would lead to something like this.
Does it tell you that the person who maybe did this was proud of what he did? Because remember, we think Frank Gebhardt, if you're the prosecution, he bragged about this to a lot of people about what he did.
Well, I think that's a separate issue, but yes, I mean, that seems to be what the prosecution is hoping was his undoing here. And it happens more than you would think, that people end up in jail and they talk to their cellmates, they talk to other people. Over the course of 35 years, if he had kept this quiet, you would think that there would not probably have been a reopening of this case at this point. Maybe not enough to bring him to trial, but that's not the case here.
Why would he open his mouth? Why would he do it? If this is all true?
Jesse, why would somebody commit this crime in the first place? I mean, these are very sick people who do this. These are people who can't conform their behavior to their own best interests, to society's rules. These are very, very sick people.
And it just gives you a glimpse into another part of the country that a lot of people might not know about. But speaking of the words of Frank Gebhardt, did you know that he gave a jailhouse interview? And in case you haven't seen it, let's see what it looks like.
The reason we're here and what we wanted to talk to you about now is in 1983 there was a body found in North Pollard County. There was a black guy that was found dead off Manor Road.
In 83?
In 83.
How many years? That's been 30-something years?
It's been a while. And so the guy that's in the picture, you don't know, right? Because you said a while ago.
No, I don't know it.
Okay, that's all I want to know.
But why you come up out those knives and wail? You trying to twist my ass around.
No, I'm telling you what people are saying.
You know, I'm trying to twist my ass around what you're trying to do.
I'm telling you what people are saying.
I don't care what you say.
Okay. They're saying that you said that you threw the knife.
I don't care what you say.
They also say that you admitted to killing that guy in that picture in the park.
I don't care what you say.
But you're not denying it. But you're not denying it.
Damn right I deny it. So I know if I kill somebody or not. I ain't no damn fool. I might be crazy, but I ain't no fool.
Would you tell us if you killed somebody?
You goddamn right I would.
Okay, so that was the defendant's jailhouse interview. Ross, what I found interesting about that was maybe not so much the content, but how he was answering them. The certain ways he was responding back to them, because we didn't learn more information. What did you make of it?
I mean, I thought the whole thing was very bizarre. From a legal perspective, I'm not even sure how that was admissible and what the defense was doing here and not objecting to that coming in. He doesn't admit anything there. He's denying it. His statements appear to be consistent with the defense. So I don't see how this is admissible. I don't even know why.
But using derogatory language to refer to Timothy Coggins?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see that. That's the kind of thing that's inflammatory towards a jury and doesn't really weigh in favor of one verdict or the other. So if I was the defense lawyer, I'd be jumping up and down and trying to keep that out.
In other words, his reactions could have been somebody who really is guilty, or it could have been somebody who's not guilty.
Totally
He said, I had nothing to do with
his innocence.
Okay, well, we have a lot more to talk about in this case, so we're going to take a break, and we're going to recap more of this brutal killing, a cold case that really heated up in the past few years, and here on Law and Crime, we cover covered the trial of Frank Gebhardt. So we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime.
What did he seem like when he's telling you that he and Bill killed this boy? I mean, is he ashamed? Is he upset?
It didn't seem like it to me, no.
Okay, did it seem like he was proud of it?
Well, he didn't have no kind of reaction much any which way you do it. I mean,
He just matter of fact told you.
yeah, he just spit it out, and that's all I know about it. I mean,
Did he ever say anything else about it?
never talked about it again. He's been to my house, I've been to his house. He never mentioned it again.
Did he tell you what Bill did to the victim?
He said he stabbed him.
Okay, did he tell you how many times?
He didn't never say about that.
Okay. Now, have you been friends with the defendant since this time?
Yeah.
Okay. And do you have anything against him? Are you mad at him in any way?
Mm-mm.
What did you do with this information? What did you do with it when he told you a couple weeks after you found the body that he and Bill Moore had killed this boy? What did you do with this information?
I took it to Dean Ray.
And who is Dean Ray?
He was a narcotic agent.
You say was, he's deceased now.
Yeah, he's deceased now.
Okay. So you told Dean Ray about this a couple of weeks after you found the body?
Well, about 3 days after Frankie told me, I run into Dean and told him.
Okay. And you don't know what happened with that information?
Nothing for what I know.
Okay.
I mean, nothing never come about it.
When was the first time an investigator came to you and did a formal interview with you?
I want to say about 8 months ago.
All right, Ross, this is a friend of the defendant coming out years later and delivering a bombshell in that courtroom. What do you make of it?
I mean, that's devastating testimony. That's somebody who, as far as we can see before we get to the cross-examination, appears to have no reason or no motive or no bias, no reason to testify falsely, to make this up. It would be a difficult situation for him to come and testify. And he closed the loophole by saying, I didn't keep this to myself for 35 years. I went and told somebody right after this admission was made. This is rough testimony. This is very effective testimony for the prosecution.
How is it possible that people who have this information, they tell people, it doesn't come out for years? I mean, the whole way this whole case broke was from a tip, and the way it exploded is, multiple people were arrested involved with the Coggins murder and cover-up is basically from information finally coming forward. What does this lesson tell everybody about other kinds of cold cases?
I mean, I guess, the statistics are extremely, extremely low on how many convictions people get in cold cases, closed cases, something like 1%. I guess this holds out hope for families of victims, for cold case investigators and prosecutors who are still working on these cases, that you can build a good case even after 3.5 decades.
Now, we're going to keep playing informants who come forward with information. You heard the defense team say you have to understand where this information comes from. Maybe if that was one witness, but how do they keep arguing witness after witness after witness is lying?
This witness actually is a good example of someone who doesn't have all of that baggage with them, but with the others, prosecutors often use strength in numbers. If you have a bunch of flawed witnesses, if you have, the more you have, the more you can put forward, the less likely it may be in jurors' minds that one individual is making this up. If they all have the same story, if that story detail matches from one to another.
Now, you had talked about it earlier, the idea of if this is all true, why would Frank Gebhardt come forward and admit his crimes? That is a sense of pride. Remember, the idea here is that this was a racially motivated killing. Can you expand upon that a little bit? Yeah,
I mean, it's a sign of pride. I think they're going to show that he had, racist tattoos, Nazi symbols, Klan tattoos, Aryan pride tattoos. I think it's also a sign of recklessness, the kind of person who would go out and do something like this in a small town, who would leave a body laying in the middle of the road. Is the same type of person jurors are expected to believe here that would go out and talk about it after.
Leaving a body for everyone to see in that brutalized fashion, that's a symbol, though. That's a sign. That's a saying something to the community, as opposed to just making someone disappear, though.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it appears to also have been a sign of confidence that police were not going to put their full resources into this, were not going to try to find the person responsible at the time in 1983.
We'll talk about who's responsible. Frank Gebhardt was on trial. We're playing you informants, people who came forward and said they have more information. I want to move now to Robert Smith, Gebhardt's friend, who's going to claim that, you know, Gebhardt told him about the murder too. Take a look.
Familiar with that picture?
Yes, sir, I am.
You know the person in that picture?
Yes, sir. This is the guy, Mr. Coggins, that I've seen around this one.
And if you could speak up a little bit so the last juror here can hear.
Yes, I do know him.
Is that the person you know as Timothy Coggins?
Yes, sir.
Is that the person that you saw in the trailer park on multiple occasions?
Yes, sir, it is.
Is that the person that you saw partying at parties with Mr. Gebhardt and Mr. Moore?
Yes, sir, it is.
No, that's what it should be.
Yes.
Mr. Smith, do you recall a party at the trailer park where Tim ran to your trailer or the trailer you were at?
Yes, sir, I do. I was down there. It was like 3 trailers on the back side of the road of it. I was down in the middle trailer in between the two, and up on the hill is where Gebhardt lived, and they was having a party up there. And us guys down here, you know, we was drinking and stuff, just hanging out. And I remember Mr. Coggins come running down through there, and he ran up in the trailer. Somebody told him to hide in the trailer. And the guy that lived there, I believe his name was like Dennis or something like that. But he lived there, and he told him, said, run in the trailer, hide in the trailer.
You can't testify as to what other people said, okay?
Yes. But Mr. Coggins had come running. I was sitting on the stairs of the trailer. He come running up past me into the trailer. And that was the last time I seen Mr. Coggins on that day. But I seen Bill and I seen Frankie. They was running down there, and they was hollering, where'd that little nigger go? They was looking for the little nigger, and that's what they was hollering.
At some point, were you and Mr. Gebhardt together again?
Yes, yes.
And did Mr. Gebhardt say anything about the murder that occurred in 1983?
Yes, sir, he did. I was at a residence over on Patterson Road, which I believe was Mr. Gebhardt's at the time. And we was all sitting around drinking and cooking out or whatever. And he was like, asked me if I remembered back the time when we hung out at the trailer park in Sunnyside. Because he said that he was waiting on this girl to show up that night, who was a friend of the girl I was with. And I had just told him, I said, well, I seen her over on Drury Avenue. She was over there with these people over there, them dope heads and everything. And he said, over there with all them black people? And I said, yeah. And he said, I figured she was one of them nigger lovers, you know. And then he stated to me, he said, well, you remember back in the day, he said that one, he didn't ever live to tell about that white girl he was with.
Okay, another piece in the puzzle. Ross, we talked about it a little bit, want to get back into it. The way this whole came about was a tip was delivered to the investigators, and then just more tips started pouring in. They started interviewing, I think, more than 60 people about Coggins' death. Why does that happen? One tip can lead to opening up a case. How does that happen that everything starts flooding? People start coming with information. I'm sure people come with also false information as well. But why is it, if someone comes forward, then everybody will come forward?
You know, I think the first thing that you have to have, the first piece of luck that somebody has to have is you have to get a motivated investigator to take that first call. And once you do, an investigator can start opening up, reopening up things, start reaching out and calling other people. And you really need a stroke of luck. You need to get the right people involved. You need to get energy on behalf of law enforcement and a willingness to do really hard work, because it's difficult to find leads that are this old.
This is rare, correct? This is rare that you have a case this old that's then seen to trial with people.
Extremely rare. I think the statistics are something like 5% of the cases actually end up being prosecuted, and of those, you know, a very small percentage actually result in a conviction. Very difficult.
Do you think half of it is, yes, there's a question about whether or not this investigation was botched, but also technology's changed, right? You know, we have ways of identifying people, tracking their locations. DNA analysis that they didn't have 35 years ago. Do you expect that there will be more unsolved cases starting today, or is it we are just going to be that's going to be something of the past?
Well, we're certainly seeing cases where DNA evidence could not be tested at the time, but it could be tested now. So you're seeing it in a lot of rape cases. Here, that's not the case because the DNA evidence didn't survive, so that testing couldn't be done. In a case like this, it's a little bit different. I think the prosecution's very lucky. A lot of these witnesses are still alive. A lot of them could be located, and they were willing to tell their story at this point. Apparently, whatever fear or whatever emotions they had towards this defendant at the time are no longer a factor.
Well, there's no statute of limitations. You find out who did it, they can be charged.
For murder, it's one of the rare cases, yeah.
Yeah, and so I can't help but think that this might be, whatever way the verdict goes, and whichever way this ultimately goes, this might be a sign of things to come. You know, if people see that there's information to open up these old cases, maybe even racially fueled cases, this might be the start of it.
Well, I think that's a great message to send, and if this case does send that, I think it's a very good thing because it gives families hope, it gives prosecutors hope, it gives law enforcement hope that they could actually get a good result after all these years.
And you can only imagine what it's like for the Coggins family to finally see people being brought on trial for this murder so many years later. We'll take a break, but when we come back, we're going to play you more testimony from informants having some interesting things to say about Mr. Gebhardt. We'll be right back. Gebhardt said that he threw the knife in the well. Ross, that is not the best thing for the defense to hear.
No, I mean, this is how you build a case. You put on one witness after another, each with a little piece of the crime.
Let me ask you a question as a defense attorney, okay? Is there an avenue for him to explore, for his defense team to say, hey, listen, he bragged about it, said everything, he had everything to do with it. But he didn't do it. He bragged about it because he wanted to appear tough, especially in prison. He wanted to seem like a tough guy. I mean, is that a way to say, you know, his whole life he took the blame or he took credit for crimes he didn't commit? Is there an avenue? I've seen this happen before.
You could go that way. You could also, you know, attack these witnesses for coming forward 35 years later, for inaccurate recollections, for having some other motive to testify falsely against this person. I think it's difficult to own that statement and then tell a jury, yes, he admitted to a heinous, horrible hate crime, but he didn't really do it. He was taking credit for it.
Listen, I'm just trying to think of avenues for the defense to explore. What other ways could they go?
Well, with a witness like this is somebody who's already incarcerated. Even though you heard at the very end of that clip, you know, did my office promise you anything? No. But this is obviously someone who is trying to curry favor, or could be argued as trying to curry favor with prosecutors and law enforcement. He's currently incarcerated. He might have charges pending. He might be serving a certain sentence that he's trying to get lowered. Much more difficult are the earlier witnesses who apparently have nothing to gain. They were former friends or even current friends of the defendant here and came forward to testify about this.
And do you think that there's something to be said for if you're Frank Gebhardt and you know you committed this crime, man, I can't believe I'm sitting here and everybody I spoke to I thought was a friend or somebody I could trust just came back and is testifying against me.
Yeah, but you know what? The defense knew about all these witnesses beforehand. There are no surprise witnesses at a criminal trial in America. There are witness lists that are exchanged. Prior statements made to law enforcement are provided. It's surprising in a way that this case went to trial because we haven't seen the defense yet, but it seems like a very, very difficult case to defend.
Yeah, it's a very difficult case to defend because there's these really interesting, incriminating statements being made. Let's take a break. When we come back, though, we are going to continue showing you witnesses testifying against Gebhardt. So we'll be right back. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime. Another witness testifying against Frank Gebhardt, although we saw him a little bit earlier on, back here to talk more about this and analyze the really complex details of this case. Back here with criminal defense attorney Ross Kramer. So you're watching this. Being a racist isn't a crime, but if those comments are true, they really do tie into the motive, right?
Yeah, I mean, it adds a lot of color to why this horribly brutal crime took place. I mean, this wasn't just your run-of-the-mill murder. I think that's why you're covering it today. This was a real hate crime, and there has to be something behind that.
I'm still shocked. I mean, reviewers maybe were just joining us that this took 35 years to bring someone to trial.
Absolutely, it's a travesty that in America in the 1980s, we're not talking about the 1950s, we're not talking about the 1920s, that a case like this could go cold in a small community without law enforcement working this to death, working this until they found the perpetrator.
And again, just for any reviewers joining us, do you get a sense that perhaps there was a feeling back in 1983 when there was an investigation, you know what, we're just going to turn a blind eye to this, it doesn't really matter?
There must have been, and I think that the prosecutor embraced that in her opening statement. She said, this was an embarrassment, I admit it, every witness is going to admit it, but we're trying to make that right now.
Yep, and one of the ways that they tied Frank Gebhardt to this years later is his own words, or his alleged own words. Let's move on to the testimony of Christopher Vaugh, who is Gebhardt's acquaintance, and we'll talk more about him being a racist, him confessing. Let's see what he had to say.
How did you come upon the body?
We was out shooting squirrels, and my dad has a real bad hatred for woodpeckers because they used to get on the side of our house and really loud. And there was a woodpecker out there. My dad was going to shoot it, and my cousin Keith said, "Don't shoot. There's a man laying over there asleep." And everybody was looking. Nobody could find him. My dad's like, "Where?" Nobody sees anything. So my dad went to shoot the woodpecker again, and he pushed the gun down. I said, "I'm telling you, there's a man over there asleep."
I'm objecting to my you're saying.
I don't think it goes for the truth of the matter asserted, Your Honor. He's just kind of orienting us all to how they found it.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Judge.
And then it happened 3 times. Finally, my dad said, "They better be somebody laying over there asleep." So we all walked over to where he supposedly seen the person sleeping, and the body was laying there. And my dad said, "You can throw a hand grenade over there. He's not going to wake up."
So it was obvious that this person was dead?
It's obvious.
Okay. What condition was the body in?
Bad shape.
Okay, could you tell if it was a man or a woman?
At that time, I was a kid.
Could you tell if it was a black person or a white person?
You could tell it was a black person.
Okay. Now, did you have an occasion to tell anyone about what you had found?
Yes, my dad never reported it that day.
Okay. Now, were you at a party with the defendant a short time later?
Yeah, probably some months later, but yes.
Okay. Who else was there?
Willard, Barry, my dad. I can't remember everybody, but.
What was his demeanor when he was telling you about this over the years?
Just a matter of fact, it was no remorse.
No remorse?
No.
What about shame?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did he ever appear to be bragging?
Sometimes you would take it as that.
Okay. Did he ever say it when he
Was angry.
was angry?
Yes, ma'am.
What would he say when he was angry?
He got into an argument with a guy that was working on a house and told him that he would kill him like he did the black guy.
Okay. And is that what he said?
Now, his exact words was, "I'll kill you like I did that nigger."
Okay. And I want you to use his exact words for the jury. I understand. It might be uncomfortable, but use exact words. And when he would refer to the gentleman that was killed on Minter Road on the other occasions, how would he refer to him?
The niggers.
Okay. Did that surprise you that he used that word?
No, ma'am.
Why not?
Bill and him, they do not like black folks.
Okay. Have you heard them express opinions about black men sleeping with white women?
That's not something they tolerate or agree with at all.
Okay. And you're pretty adamant when you say it. Why?
I mean, that's the way it's always been. I grew up around them, and that's their attitudes towards that has never changed.
Okay.
And another bombshell thrown against the defense right there. Now, here's the question I have for you, Ross. Really incriminating stuff. This guy is a convicted child molester. Should we believe him?
Well, there are 2 questions here, I think. One, should we believe him? And number 2, should the prosecution have called him? The prosecution called a bunch of clean witnesses, which means that there's no really overarching impeachment material against those witnesses. They were just friends with the defendant, and they were testifying as to what they recall. when you start to throw in on the prosecution's case people with these really rough backgrounds, you adopt their credibility as part of the prosecution's case, and you give the defense an opening here to argue, listen to this parade of terrible people that they expect you to believe.
Oh, parade of terrible people. Let's make sure we got this. So 6 men testified that Gebhardt told them that he killed Coggins. 5 were incarcerated. 1 is a member of the Aryan Nation, and this other one is again, a convicted child molester. So quite the rogues gallery of people that they're bringing out, but in general, when you have these witnesses testifying, they may be not good people, they might have committed bad crimes, they might not be the best, but does that mean that they're being untruthful?
You know, that's the argument the prosecution has to make. That's what makes a case like this interesting. That gives a little bit of daylight to a defense lawyer who can argue that, you know, these are the people the prosecution's expecting you to believe beyond a reasonable doubt and convict a man of murder.
Especially since everybody was coming out after that one tip, and now everybody's coming forward. Maybe the defense has an argument. I'll tell you what, speaking about their argument, when we come back after our break, we're going to show you the defense's closing argument, and then we'll show you the verdict. We'll be right back.
Who lived and associated with people at Gary's trailer park. Is this a story about that? Is this a story about those folks who in the months and years after, maybe something was said at a party, maybe somebody bragged, maybe somebody said something that made somebody believe that Frankie Gebhardt had something to do with this murder, and then it has been built up over the course of 34, 35 years until we're here. And until now we're making up stuff. You've got inmates coming out of the jail to make up stories. Is that what's possible? Suicide, but you know, we all believe he did it. And, you know, small towns are full of that. It happens. And over the course of 34, 35 years, it can happen a lot. And it did happen. Because you've got these people who have associated with each other for that long period of time. Said that Terry Reed said that Frankie Gebhardt told him that victim's penis was cut off, put him out again. It's not true. So either Mr. Reed is lying or Mr. Gebhardt doesn't know what happened. And if he don't know what happened, it was because he wasn't there. Because people are making up stories. Ladies and gentlemen, that didn't happen. But that's what Mr. Reed is saying it happened. He told me that. Oh, yeah, he told me what they did. So it's not true. It's not true. It's a reasonable doubt because it's not true.
All right, we played so much of the prosecution's case. You saw a little bit, Ross, there of the defense's closing argument. How do you think they did at summarizing everything for the that's going to be their last attempt to convince this jury one way or another?
I think not great. I think that could have been a lot more clear and a lot more impassioned. It reminded me a lot of the opening statement for the defense when it had the feeling of somebody going through the motions, as opposed to the prosecutor's opening statement that felt very passionate, really touched on what the keystones of this case are about. I felt that this defense lawyer, even at the end, was sort of just making very light hits at the evidence instead of standing there and saying, you know, there are 3 reasons why you shouldn't convict in this case. They're very clear, and here they are. You can't send a person to jail based on this weak evidence.
In any case, how tough is it for a jury to convict somebody?
It's very tough. You have to get 12 people in a room who were strangers before the case started to agree on a life and death decision here. You know how hard it is in your regular life to get 12 people to agree on anything, what they're having for lunch that day. To get them to agree on a case like this is very, very hard.
You want to see if they were able to come to a verdict?
That'd be interesting.
Okay. We're going to show you right now. This is the verdict in the Frank Gebhardt trial. We're talking about the murder, the brutal murder of Timothy Coggins. Remember, he faced multiple charges. Let's see what they decided.
In the Superior Court of Spalding County, State of Georgia versus William Franklin Gebhardt, defendant, criminal action number 18R105A. Having considered whether the state has proven each element of the following offenses, we, the jury, unanimously find as follows. Count 1, malice murder, guilty. Count 2, felony murder, guilty. Count 3, aggravated battery, guilty. Count 4, aggravated assault, guilty. Count 5, concealing the death of another, guilty. Signed this 26th day of June 2018, signed by their foreperson. Do y'all wish to look at the verdict form?
Guilty across the board, and it should be noted that Frank Gebhardt was sentenced to life in prison plus 20 years. So what does that mean? How did they come up with that estimation, 20 life in prison plus 20 years?
I think because certain of the counts he was convicted of couldn't be sentenced to life, so they wanted to sentence him on all the counts. So some of them had a 20-year max, so they sentenced him.
Well, after he dies, he's got that 20 years to serve. We can't forget that. Now, it should be noted that after this verdict, Bill Moore Sr., his co-defendant, had pled guilty to his involvement in the Coggins killing, voluntary manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 30 years with 20 to be served in prison. What did you make of that?
Well, after watching a trial like this and watching how the evidence mounted, a real mountain of evidence here, I think any co-defendant who watched this was probably wise to take a plea and try to get out of it with a chance of getting out of jail alive.
Now, what is the Coggins family? How do they move forward with these kinds of verdicts? I'm sure this was some sort of justice for them. It doesn't bring back Timothy, but what do you think about how they're feeling after this?
I mean, it's very, very partial closure. We talk about this all the time. There's a victim in this case, the decedent, but there's so many other victims. I'm sure this family's life was never the same after this happened. The jurors in this case, the judge, the prosecutors, the defense lawyers, everyone else in that town who saw this, who lived through this when it happened. There's so many victims here. The family could get some degree of closure, but I'm sure this is never going to leave them.
Yeah, it's quite the case. And Ross Kramer, thanks so much for coming on. We appreciate your insight as always.
Always
and
fun.
Be sure to come back on.
I will.
All right, everybody, when we come back, we're going to talk about our second trial. And again, we're talking about those brutal killings. And how could we not talk about the trial of Cody Lott, who was on trial for the really savage shooting of Lauren Landavazo, a 13-year-old girl, and also injuring another 13-year-old girl named Michaela Smith in just a hail of gunfire. This was a 22-year-old man. Very interesting case where issues of the insanity defense came up as well. So we'll take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to cover this case. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime.